Let's begin once again in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, O Lord, and they shall be created.
And thou shalt renew the face of the earth.
O Lord, who enlightens the hearts of your faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever enjoy his consolation. Through the same Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Our Lady, seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
Saint Anthony Mary Claret.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
I don't know which came the name, his or the wine first, but anyway, the claret. But thank you all for coming today. We continue on the moral virtues as outlined in the book by Josef Pieper, so the Cardinal Moral Virtues. And I was just checking to see, because it's interesting as you hear him speak, or not speak, write, how some of the teachings, although the teachings themselves have a certain timelessness because they apply to the human person and the human person hasn't changed. So therefore the morals, what were right 100 years ago, are still right today insofar as they're applied accurately to human nature. But the culture and the milieu has changed so much that you realize, and he was realizing this when he was writing them. So we did the Virtue of Prudence last week, where we basically just looked at the role of prudence as the queen of the four cardinal virtues, and that without prudence you cannot actually have justice, fortitude, and temperance. And he wrote that essay in 1959. Then he wrote today we're going to do the article on justice, which is the next part of flowing from prudence. So prudence's role is to give the mind, really effectively it's like the conscience of the person. So it's to give the mind the clarity to be able to make a particular judgment in a particular situation, to bring the person to the point of action. Justice is about executing that action. He wrote that essay, or today's essay, in 1955, and then Fortitude and Temperance he wrote in 1954. So it's interesting, he wrote the last ones first, and then Justice, so Fortitude and Temperance, 1954, then Justice, 55, and then Virtue. A bit like writing the introduction, you might say, to a thesis or a book after you've written the book, which apparently is most often the case. But before we go on to his 7-topic treatment of what justice is and what it isn't, why don't we just go around the room, since there's a few of us here today, and just see what would be a rough definition of justice. Who wants to kick a ball off? What is justice? What would we say? Yeah.
Giving what is owed.
Giving what is owed, yep. Okay, that's one possibility. Giving each man what is his due. Would you accept that? Yeah. You know where that comes from?
No.
Plato made it popular, but actually goes back to Homer. And he mentions that in his essay. That's how far down it's come. So a Greek, classical writer. So that's one definition of justice. Anything else? To give each one what is his due. Any other definitions? There are other definitions, and they're also right as well. Anyone wants to have a... No? Okay.
To be fair in every matter you're dealing with.
Okay, to be fair in every matter that you're dealing with. And fairness is the rule of to be just, basically. Yep, okay. Any other things? Because that's, when you introduce the question of fairness, it's actually quite broad. And this area is massive. I mean, he wrote about 60, 70 pages on this. It's a big area. Prudence was shorter, fortitude will be shorter, but this is massive, and so is temperance. Temperance is, we'll do that next year, and I'll have to do that in 2 sections. So any other thoughts on justice? What makes an act just? What makes it unjust? Well, there I'm already going on to the next thing. So justice, giving each man what is his due, or being fair in everything, every action to everyone. Okay. Well, he breaks it down to 7 sections. One, he talks about rights. The second section, he talks about duties. The third section, he talks about the rank of justice. Why is justice placed in number 2 in terms of the 4 cardinal moral virtues and not in number 3 or 4? We've established last time why prudence has to be in number 1, because without prudence you cannot have the other 3 moral virtues. But he argues why justice in fact must be in the 2nd place. Then he talks about the 3 kinds of justice, and 3 basic forms. We'll go through those. Basically, what is owed to another person, what is owed to the community or to the state, and then what the state owes to an individual member. Then recompense or restitution as an aspect of justice. So that's section 5. Section 6 is on distributive justice, which is by far the longest section. He has about 20 odd pages or even slightly more on distributive justice. So we're going to have to just kind of tiptoe through that, because that's where we talk about the devil is in the details. Well, the distributive justice is in fact a very thorny issue, because it's talking about individuals' relationship with a community and the community's relationship with the individual. And it's interesting to see how we can very quickly reduce that to unhealthy situations that would result in either totalitarianism or a glorification of the self in individualism without any duties towards the community or the social structure. And then the last one is to look a little bit at the limits of the virtue of justice, to see that not everything can actually be brought about by justice. So, the first section then, he goes into an explanation and he tries to say, well, what is it that is justice? You know, he says that most of the problems in the world, and could you keep the time for me again, please? Most of the problems in the world and in society, in one form or another, have to do with a perceived injustice. Whether we call it an unfairness, or whether we call it justice, or some other disadvantage, inequality, whatever it happens to be, that most of them have to do with the virtue of justice. Now, justice, whatever it is, before we get into that, has to do with an action. And this action is directed outside of the person, which is really jumping ahead a little bit to the second section. But the virtue of prudence, remember, as we mentioned last time, talks about the mind understanding truth, understanding situation in their concreteness, and having a true memory of that, and then using all that information, that experiential knowledge over one's life to actually assess the situations and to assess them accurately. Justice, on the other hand, is strictly speaking very much geared towards what is owed to another person. Whereas fortitude and temperance have to do with the person themselves in relation to themselves. For example, if I steal something that doesn't belong to me, which is the definition of stealing, everybody can see that is an injustice. And he gives this example. Whereas if I drink one glass of wine too many, well, no one can really tell, unless they know me very well, what is an injustice, whether it's an act of intemperance or not. Because only I can know that when I've reached my limit. My limit might be a glass. My limit might be 4 glasses. But only that's an internal awareness. So we judge the situation about justice in terms of an action done towards another. But why is this action done towards the other person? Is there some kind of obligation there, or is it just something that we want to do so? And this is where he goes down the line of rights. That he says the action of justice is actually a right that a person has to receive in him or herself. So it's not something that, because if we say that it is in fact owed, if we go with the first definition that we heard, although both of them I think accurately sum up the virtue of justice, certainly as Josef Pieper is doing it following St. Thomas, that if we give a person what is his due, how do we determine what is due to that person? Is it something that the person says, well, this is owed to me? Is it something that is attributed to them? Well, you've reached 17 and you've passed the test on the computer and you've passed the driving test, so now it's owed to you that you have a driver's license in the state of New South Wales, for example. Or is it something actually deeper than that? Now, he's writing this essay, remember, in 1955. The Communist Revolution took place in 1917. Communist Russia and the Baltic states had already taken place. The Yalta Agreement, 1947. The revolution in Mao in China, and that spread where, in terms of people's liquidation and execution of a person or justice, something inalienable actually wasn't agreed upon by a state. And if it's not agreed upon by a state and not honoured, does it mean that the person therefore doesn't have a right? And Pieper is arguing absolutely. So ultimately, justice presupposes that there is a right on the other person, and that right is founded on who they are as a person, as a thinking individual who desires their own perfection, who desires their own freedom, where they go in life, what they will do, what they won't do. He gives an example of an owner of a dog, and he says, let's say the dog or the master has trained the dog into getting a dog biscuit every time it does a particular action that the dog has learnt as a good thing. And so, I don't know, the dog comes and rolls on the ground in front of the master when the master comes into the home after work. And every occasion he gives him a dog biscuit. If on one occasion, let's say, the master doesn't give him a dog biscuit, has the master been unjust towards the dog? And he says, no, he hasn't been. He's been forgetful, he's been a bit thoughtless, whatever. But even if he decides to no longer reward the dog for that behavior, the master hasn't actually been unjust towards the dog, because the dog hasn't got a right as such to the biscuit. Even if it decides to roll around 3 times or learns how to do somersaults or whatever, the dog doesn't have that right. Whereas, if a right is truly going to oblige somebody else in justice to act towards that person in a particular way, then it's going to be based on something much deeper, much more fundamental. And ultimately, he bases it on the fact that a person is a spiritual being who is made in the image and likeness of God. Now, this is the fundamental essence of a person's human dignity. Again, writing this essay in 1955, communist atheism was rife in various parts of the world, but still a lot of parts of the West had believed in God and held this as sacred. You might say in our own age, is a definition like this actually sufficient to distinguish or uphold a person's right as inalienable? Can we really say that? Does someone's non-belief in God actually nullify that or not? Well, people like St. John Paul II, working in his Lublin School in philosophy, were precisely under in his own philosophy department and in the whole methodology of phenomenology, was actually sharpening the tools there to argue that the human dignity, the human person, had rights regardless of what the philosophy system or the belief system, the creedal system of a state may be, that a person had inalienable human rights. And this is very much in contrast to what you might get out of Marxism, which is the whole battle of the classes, and as communism has been lived out, it has been seen as not at all interest in the community of the persons, but in fact in having an elite class, which is a smaller group, ruling the vast majority, who were an inferior or considered to be inferior according to their perceptions, and because they didn't hold that creedal position. So a right of a person has to be founded on their dignity as a human being, made in the image and likeness of God. And I would argue if someone didn't believe in God and therefore say, well, sorry, you just happen to be the weaker person here, you don't actually have a right. Well, we can still uphold that and say they do have a right. Even though that right may be violated, even though that person may be damaged in some way, that right is still there. He doesn't actually list a whole list of what we might call as inalienable human rights, but the church certainly does. And I should mention some of those here. For instance, the first of our inalienable human rights, well, I won't state the obvious, you tell me, what would be the first of our inalienable human rights of every individual human being? Yeah.
Free will. Freedom. Yes. Life.
Life.
Oh, yeah.
The fundamental. So freedom is absolutely there. So freedom of speech and freedom of self-determination is that very much there. But life has to be, it's the right without which we cannot enjoy any other right. So freedom. What else would be? Now let's just think a little bit more widely. Think about families, parents, first educators of their children, deciding how to educate their children, where to educate their children. Some countries are legislating on who can educate their children. Can a parent actually decide to educate their children because they don't have an education degree? Is this what's necessary in order to educate children? So therefore can homeschooling be allowed by parents? Or must they send themselves to a particular school? Does it have to be a government school? Can it be a Catholic school or another private school? Do they have to have LBGT education? QRSV, I used to like to say, and add all the letters keep on adding. But does it have to have that kind of education in there? Does it have to have some other element within there? So the right to education of children, this belongs to the parents. The right to find adequate work. It may not be actually the work that you may want to do, but there's an inalienable right to work, to have work. And the working conditions must be safe, they must be fair, they mustn't be exploitative. In other words, whenever one of these rights is violated, there's something that's actually going to damage the human person. And that's why then it obliges the other person to actually carry them out. So we move then on to that second section of his essay, which is the duty in relation to the other. If it's a right for one person, an inalienable human right, then it's obviously a duty of someone else to observe that right. Whether the justice is in a one-to-one interaction, I am a gardener, I come and do your gardening, I agree beforehand that it will cost so much money, it'll take me however many hours, or it'll be so much money per hour. I do the garden, I do it properly, and you owe me that. So there's a right for restitution to the work or for the work that I have done. This again establishes, and you might say this is a commutative right, but it's direct relation, one-to-one. This has established because of a prior agreement that I have done with you. So it's not so much an inalienable human right, but once we have entered into this agreement together, now there is like a contract. Whether we actually sign a piece of paper or not is beside the point. The fact is there has been an agreement there, and that is a strict justice thing. But even apart from that, let's say I am in a ruling power or in a government, and then it comes to not only paying somebody an amount of money, but I've got to actually recognize the duties. I have a duty to recognize the inalienable human rights of another person in society. Then that calls from me an obligation, and that obligation is based on the fact that they have a dignity that is not given by themselves. The dignity that we have as human beings is a dignity that comes before us, that we have not earned, that is not justly given to us. And the fact that we are a creature immediately then goes pointing towards a creator. And when we look at what God has given to us, the gift of life, the gift of freedom, the gift of intelligence, and intelligence and freedom presuppose one another. We cannot have freedom if we were not given the gift of intelligence. And we cannot have the gift of intelligence without the ability to self-determination. Doesn't make sense. So the two work together. And as John Paul II would also add, the human being has the gift of a heart. In other words, there's an emotional life there that enables us to respond in terms of what we perceive and what we choose. And it's quite possible that God could have made a soul and a body, a human person, but without the gift or the ability to feel, without emotions. It would be a very impoverished human existence, but it's quite possible. For instance, when he made the angels, who are, pure spirits, they, as far as we know, they don't feel. There's no feeling, there's no emotion in the angels, even though we may, attribute things by analogy, joy, love. The love of angels is a purely directed from their will. There's no emotional life, whereas we actually have that. So the role of the other, for justice to actually exist, then I have to feel that duty and to actually honor it. So justice, the virtue of justice, lies in the person who is actually upholding and respecting the rights of the other, but the act of justice is the action, and that action is externally quantifiable. Now, it's also important to mention and to bear in mind that the action, although it's objectively a just act or an unjust act, nevertheless, the motive does have something to do with it. The action remains a just act. But for instance, if I misunderstand something and I do something that is unjust, thinking that that was actually a just thing to do, externally, have I committed an unjust act? Externally. Yes, I have, because I've done something that objectively can be quantified. Remember, justice is following from the indications presented to it by prudence. Prudence is about the truth in the concrete instance. But internally, have I committed the sin of injustice? I actually haven't, because my intention was misguided. So then it'd be like committing a sin by accident. I can do an action that would externally, or if I knew, if it were accompanied by a proper understanding, it would be sinful. But if my internal understanding is misguided, then it wouldn't be a sin. That's why in order to commit a mortal sin, I need to have the three conditions met simultaneously. It needs to be a grave matter, I need to have adequate knowledge or full knowledge, and I need to have full consent. If either of these three conditions is either not fully there or only partially there, then there is no mortal sin. I can't commit a mortal sin by accident. He then moves on to the rank of justice. Why is justice presented in number 2 position in the whole role of the ordering of the moral virtues? Prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Because the other two, he says, fortitude and temperance, are not so much about doing the good of justice, but if they were not there, they don't actually allow me to be a just person. It's the justice that enables me to carry out the good, which is a very telling thing. Justice is always directed towards the others, and in terms of giving them what is their due. And once I've worked out what is their due in all the complex labyrinthine ways in which we relate to one another, then it's justice that enables me to do that. But if I didn't have fortitude or temperance, am I going to be able to carry out my obligation to be a just person towards those with ease, or am I going to struggle? And the answer is, I'm going to struggle if I don't have temperance, if I don't have fortitude. So if I'm cowardly, am I going to carry out my duty of justice towards my country in going to fight in a war? assuming it's a just war? Well, the answer is, I'm going to run away. But if I walk away because I misunderstand an order from a general or a sergeant or something like that, then okay, that's not an act of cowardice, even though externally it might be the same thing. But notice, I can only work out whether it's a lack of cowardice or fortitude. That's an internal measure. But I need those other two virtues, and they're in a sense at the service of justice. So that's why he says justice is number 2 position, because not only it governs, I'll just read it out so you'll get it straight from him. Thomas says justice claims a higher rank because it not only orders man in himself, but also the life of men together. And then he gives a second reason. Not only do the object and material of justice establish its higher rank, because it's directed towards the other, but the subject does too. Because without justice, I can't do any good in society. So, I think it's pretty straightforward, but it's worth pondering to see, okay, so justice is higher than fortitude and temperance. It's not just a toss of a coin that has led the classics to order them in this way. Just like justice can only come about with prudence, because if there's no prudence beforehand, there is no justice. What I think is actually good is not good, is actually some kind of disorder, a distortion. Any questions so far? We're getting to halfway. Okay. Yep.
Sorry, I wasn't here last week. Can you define prudence?
Prudence, yeah. It's simply that virtue that is based in the mind, but in the practical side of things. So the virtue of prudence, the mind has to have a theoretical understanding of the principles of the moral life and of all ways of acting, of justice, of fortitude, and of temperance. But then the virtue of prudence is that perfection of the human mind to allow it to apply those principles, those moral principles, to the concrete situation, to understand, to in a sense have that memory of the concrete, and to be able to apply them with efficiency. So it's effectively, he argues, for all intents and purposes, it is the same as your conscience. It is the mind focusing on the concrete, practical decisions, but it doesn't actually make the decision. It brings the mind to the point where now the will can take it up and run with that decision and put it into practice, which is what the role of virtue is all about. But he says that prudential judgment is essential, because without prudence the judgments that will flow forth will not be just, and will not be temperate, and will not be fortitudinous or courageous at all. And he also then says, why is it that it must come first? Not only how could you lead if you don't with prudence if it doesn't actually know what's coming down the track? Prudence, fortitude, and temperance. He says, because only the good man can be prudent, and the good man already has an inherent understanding of justice, fortitude, and temperance. So the good man is feeding off that already. That illumines or informs his prudential judgment, his thinking, his understanding, and that prudential virtue allows for these other decisions to be made. And he also mentions that nobody can be prudent in everything and in every way. So, does it give you a bit of a handle on it?
Yeah. Well, now I know the context, because I was a little bit.
For sure, no. That's for sure. So then, the 3 basic forms of justice, and I already mentioned this a little while back, is that there's the commutative side of things. So it's one person to another. What do I owe you, strictly speaking? You might say in a private capacity, or if it's one head of a company talking with another head of a company, what is owed, strictly speaking? And here we're not just talking about inalienable human rights, but because there's also other kind of rights. There's rights that are attributed, such as a government gives the right to somebody who has earned a Bachelor of Education at a particular university, and that person now has a right to apply for various jobs in the country or wherever that degree is held in esteem. It gives you a right to apply for jobs, and then for an employer, after interviews and so forth, to decide whether or not to employ you. But you need that degree. The degree equips you to have the right to work in that field. Again, why is it that the Australian government doesn't accept medical qualifications of everyone anyone who's come from overseas with medical qualifications without testing them sufficiently? I mean, apart from whatever maybe political correctness or some of those criteria that seem to be a bit of red tape, there is a very legitimate way in which those qualifications are tested. Is the knowledge of the medic sufficient for our own standards, and therefore is it just to our society to allow somebody like that to work in our society if we haven't tested them adequately? And so that's an attributed right. And those rights, attributed rights, may also be revoked. So, for instance, if I break enough rules of traffic, that government can withdraw my right to drive in whatever the state that has given me the license. Or the same with a teaching degree or medical practice or whatever. And so those things can be removed, whereas nobody can withdraw my right to life, my right to an education, my right to work, my right to freedom of speech, and so forth. They can be abused, but if they're abused, they will damage me as a person. Whereas to withdraw those other rights that have been attributed and lost because of some misdemeanor, it doesn't damage the person as such, but it lets them know the consequences of their action. Yeah.
With the right to life where it can't be removed, example of, say, like the death penalty, would that then be an abuse, or is there a way around that?
Well, no, because the way that has always been looked at is that the death penalty applied justly is because a person is deemed to be so violent and uncontrollable that they're a danger to the state. So there's no way of, in fact, controlling them by simply depriving them of their freedom. Many others, depriving of their freedom when they carry out a crime was sufficient punishment because it controlled their dangerous sphere or their sphere of influence. Some people, even when they're in prison, they're so violent or their connections are such that even when they have communication with a guard, somebody dies. I mean, I heard not all that long ago, a criminal in America, I won't mention his name or details, but whenever a police officer or a guard would talk to him, he would invariably have some kind of request which cannot be honoured, and then he'll find out who his family is and so forth, have someone assassinated, that sort of thing. To me, that would be a primary case where the only way to safeguard the state would be to actually execute them, to take their life from them. Now, John Paul II, in his letter on the Gospel of Life in 1995, said, practically speaking, those conditions no longer exist anywhere in the world. But if the situation was such that the only way that a state could protect itself from a criminal was by taking their life, then that would be a just response to a criminal act. And the other two traditional ways that a life can be taken was war, in a just war, or thirdly, in the case of self-defense. Most people, again, understand the whole thing of self-defense very readily, and war, capital punishment. Again, in most cases, I don't think the conditions are no longer there for capital punishment to be applied as a real form of justice. But it is conceivable that in some instances that those conditions, the safety of the rest of, the community cannot be guaranteed, and so that's the only way forward. But, Okay, so recompense and restitution. So whenever an injustice is done then, what does it mean for the one who has perpetrated the injustice? And he talks about two words, recompense and restitution. Very often if a confession is heard and somebody confesses a sin of stealing, even if it's not in a confession, then part of the healing process or the forgiveness is that the person actually has to make up for what they have done wrong. But and this is an important thing to understand correctly, because very often the understanding of justice is that you pluck my eye out and I'm going to pluck your eye out. And that's the eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But that's actually, strictly speaking, it's not justice. I've just done another harm to you. You have taken my eye out, one eye, and I had a right to both eyes. And you also have a right to both eyes. But now, because you plucked my eye out, do you lose the right to one of your eyes? That is not justice. That's retribution. And real justice has to be restorative. It's got to undo what has been done, the damage. And recompense or restitution are kind of fluid terms. Materially, you can restore what has been stolen. You know, if it's a large sum of money, then I could even do that with interest to some degree. However, if I destroy your good name, how am I going to do that? If I accuse somebody of falsely of a sexual accusation, or a rape, or harassment, or even if I came out and said, no, I lied, will that truly restore your good name? Now, it'll go some way to doing that, but in fact, it doesn't go all the way. So it's actually a very difficult thing to bring about, restoration or restitution and recompense. And on this earth, I mean, it's like with prudence, any of the moral virtues, it's very hard to have perfection in these ways, because once harm is done, then it's very difficult to undo it. He goes through a whole list of things, terminology, but basically he says, wherever there's a lack, there's something due, that is then there's a requirement of justice. But he goes through a whole lot of terminology, you might say sins, which nowadays just don't even make sense, like tale-bearing. Tale-bearing. Can anyone want to have a guess of what that might mean? He says even in adult conversation, this is in 1955, American culture, he's thinking, and I think he wrote it in Germany, but what I think he was getting at is spreading gossip. Spreading gossip, How many people think that spreading gossip is actually a sin against justice? Because typically I'm spreading gossip. I mean, I'll spread gossip maybe to anybody who's listening. I try not to spread gossip, by the way, just on camera. But the idea also, typically those who spread gossip to someone's friends. Did you know? I heard this and this and that. And they might make it sound also justified. And you ask them at the end of the day, do you really need to say this? Is someone's good going to be helped and advanced by you saying that? Or are you just venting? Are you just whinging about something? Now, venting has its own place, but that's why venting shouldn't just be done with anybody and everybody. It should be done with one person, a trusted person, to say, look, I just need to get something off my chest, blah, and off I do it. But tale-bearing is actually a sin. It's a sin. And, the age of social media, how easy it is to spread lies and rumors and misinformation. And not only the social media, but any of the media itself. Typically, when the media, some article defames somebody, then somebody sues them and they publish the article appears on page 1 or 2, but then they win the lawsuit, the victim, and they publish an apology on page 17, in small print or something like that. So there's a lot of difficulty in knowing how to bring about restitution and recompense. Distributive justice, this is the thorny issue that he wrestles to do his best to bring about, because he says it's one thing to deal with one person or another, but then when I'm dealing with the other kind of justice, myself towards society, towards the community. So I'm paying my taxes, for instance. I sign up for war if I get called up. I work hard for my employer because I know that will allow a contribution to the economy and ultimately to the common good. When we talked about participation in the political process, one of the talks we had earlier this year, that was always one of the touchstone of the criteria was, am I building up the common good? Am I building up the common good? It's more thorny to see, well, what's my actual duty to my state? To what degree should I uphold the laws of the state? What if I think some of those laws are actually unjust? Am I obliged to uphold an unjust law? Am I obliged to support the head of a state who seems to be unjust, who seems to be corrupt? And then, on the other hand, the distribution of that justice from the state to the individual members, because the state side to distribute justice to the individual members, they have to realize the dignity of the human person, their own inalienable rights, but also the rights that are given to them as individuals, attributed by the state. So for an Australian citizen, the right gives them, the state rather, gives them the right to vote in elections once they've reached the age of 18 years. And in fact, in Australia, we have the peculiar situation that it's both a right and a duty, because if you fail to vote, it will participate in the electoral process, then you get fined. Other countries, it is not exercised such as this. But then also you might have a situation where in distributive justice, there's a proportionality that's involved. So somebody who might say, for all intents and purposes, is the 50th person on the chain of command, that person's whatever right, here we're not talking about inalienable human rights, but in terms of, say, their pay, the pay for their work, should it be the same as the person who has worked much harder and has done more study or more formation, has more responsibility on their shoulders and doing other work? See, the communistic understanding would say, no, we're all people working together in the country, everybody should be getting 8 hours pay. So the doctor should be getting as much money as the labourer, even though the labourer hasn't done 7-8 years of study and had so much experience in doing that. Distributive justice would say, you know what, the person who is actually doing harder work and greater work does deserve greater compensation for what they're doing. But then that obviously can be abused. So for instance, you've got the examples of many countries, many politicians or parliamentarians. Upon retirement, do they get the same superannuation that everybody else in the society gets? Well, often not. They get very good bonus packages, thank you very much. Or you've got those who were ex-presidents or ex-prime ministers. Again, the same sort of thing. So those are problems. Now, should there be something given to them for the fact that they've served their country? Yes, they should. That's fair enough. But then that's got to be proportional. It can't be abusive, because the one who serves the country in the military, well, they actually get a good payout as well, or in the police force. But what if somebody has worked and served their country, not in the public service, but they've run a good small business, and that's helped the economy? Isn't that something good as well? So when we consider these principles in theory, it's very easy to say, yeah, that makes sense, that doesn't. But in practice, to see how it all plays out, it's actually much more thorny than it initially meets the eye. And so it's very hard to actually say yay or nay one way or the other, but you'd have to look at a case by case. One of the things that he mentions is that's particularly dangerous is he says that in the best situation is when you have like a monarchy and you have a just king. So the philosopher king, the idea from Plato. And that's well and good. He says, but the worst society then is when the very head of that state is unjust. So you have an unjust king. But then St. Thomas has a comment to say and make about democracy. You know what he says about democracy? He says, oh, by the way, before I say that, he says that where you get an unjust king, this is tyranny. So that's the worst thing that could happen to a society, because now the one that's meant to implement the justice, the distributive justice within the community as a whole, has been corrupted. So what do you do there? Well, obviously, there's got to be a reaction to whether it depose them or something like that. But then he says, when it comes to the democratic form of government, in a democracy, he says, tyrants can come up even more readily than in a kingship or in a monarchy. And you might think, well, why is that the case? Why is, because we tend to think as we live in a monarchy that it's the best form of government. But certainly St. Thomas didn't think that at his time. When you think of and democracy does have many things in its favour, but you also bear in mind that it's the majority is what decides who elects. And when you look at the philosophy of democracy, is that the majority decide on a particular issue. So, if, as you were saying earlier, the majority in the class decide on abortion, that abortion is right, the democratic process would say, oh, abortion is right. But in fact, abortion is extinguishing the inalienable human right of a particular person. That, according to our whole previous thinking, is the right position, so therefore abortion is wrong. But so the democracy also has its own philosophy, and just as the majority can decide about self-rule, you take that to its extreme, and it means that democracy also decides on what is right and what's wrong. And that cannot be, because now we're into the whole thing about relativism. And that's why relativism really thrives in a democratic society, in a pluralist society, because one of the mistaken forms of thinking is that the freedom of the individual human person can be exercised about anything, and that I can even decide what is true and what is false. And that's an error. All I can do is recognize what is true and what is false. Truth and falsehood are something objective to me. So, if you look at a society, democratic society, where the majority of people are not necessarily living a great moral life, but they're somewhere in between. Well, and then there's the wisdom is only going to come from a stable moral life. So if you don't have a stable moral life, you don't have wise people who are choosing their leader. Who are they going to choose as their leader? Somebody like them. And in most cases. So democracy is no guarantee for getting a virtuous leader. And that is something about why Thomas would say that in a democracy, the possibility of a tyrant can come very quickly. Look at, for instance, what's happened in Iraq. I recently have had the opportunity to speak to a couple of Iraqi families who have come to Australia as residents and as immigrants. And I asked them this simple question: was it better in Iraq under Saddam Hussein or under the present system? Without batting an eyelid, under Saddam Hussein. Even though he was a tyrant, a dictator, and an unjust man in so many ways, God rest his soul, nevertheless, there was still a greater evenness. Whereas now, there's much more chaos and abuse. Democracy hasn't exactly taken off. Now, mind you, it's not a traditionally democratic culture, and hence there is that's another question, that you can't just impose a foreign way of thinking onto a culture that has traditionally been ruled by monarchs. The final section then, and we've got 30 seconds to go, is the limits of justice. And the limits of justice are basically, there are three. Sometimes, there are many limits of justice, but sometimes justice cannot be restored. So what do you do then? Well, it requires us either to forgive or to cancel debt or minimize what is actually owed. And so he looks at three different virtues: religion, piety, and observance. And he says that these three virtues, the religion, so the relation of one's duty to God, a piety, that sense of like a child with his or her father, that we can never owe the debt that we owe to our parents, or restore the debt that we owe to our parents, because they've always done much more for us than we could ever do for them. And I often think, I do not love my parents as much as they love me. Love them as much as I want and as much as I try, they always love me more. And then the third one is that there is that sense of respect towards those in authority and those in positions of authority in society and office. So having a respect for, say, the Prime Minister, for other members of Parliament, even though I may not like them so much, but these virtues actually help us to overcome injustices, or whenever we see that justice cannot actually be drawn about, they can actually be a help. So it's Aquinas' way of basically saying that justice, the good, cannot always be done perfectly. We're not in heaven, and we can only do our best and just keep going according to what is possible for us at any given moment in time. Any quick questions? Wonderful. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you next week for the Virtue of Fortitude. Thank you.